The sun cast long shadows across the parched earth as Ruby Blackstone's scream echoed through Devil's Canyon, her hands clawing at the wall of fallen rocks that now trapped her in darkness. What had begun as a simple expedition to collect botanical specimens for her research had turned into a desperate fight for survival when the unstable canyon walls gave way without warning, sealing her inside a narrow section with no visible escape. Ruby had always prided herself on her independence. It was 1878, and at 24 years old, she had already made a name for herself as a botanist contributing to scientific journals across the country. Moving west from Boston to the Arizona Territory had been her decision alone, despite her family's protests. The frontier offered untouched species, freedom from society's constraints, and opportunity, not the death trap it had suddenly become. "Hello," she called out, her voice bouncing off the stone walls. "Is anyone there?" Only the eerie silence of the canyon answered back. The small space was growing darker as the sun's position shifted. Ruby calculated she had perhaps 2 hours of daylight left. Panic threatened to overwhelm her as she examined the pile of fallen rocks. Boulders too heavy for her to move blocked the main path she had used to enter the canyon. Her canteen was half empty, and she had only a small packet of dried fruit in her satchel. She touched the wall of debris again, testing for any weakness. A small cascade of pebbles rained down, making her jump back. The entire structure seemed precarious, and she feared attempting to climb over might trigger another collapse, possibly one that would bury her completely. Ruby took a deep breath and assessed her situation. The narrow passage extended deeper into the canyon behind her, but she knew from her previous explorations that it eventually dead-ended at a sheer wall. She was trapped, plain and simple. As the shadows lengthened, Ruby's scientific mind calculated the odds of rescue. She had mentioned her expedition to the canyon to Mrs. Holloway at the boarding house, but no one would miss her until tomorrow at the earliest. The chances of a random traveler passing by were slim. Devil's Canyon was off the main trails, which was precisely why she had chosen it for her research. Miles away, Hayes Porter guided his horse along the rim of the canyon, his keen eyes scanning the terrain below. At 32, he had spent more years in the saddle than out of it, working as a scout, a ranch hand, and occasionally, when times were lean, a bounty hunter. Today, he was tracking a small herd of wild mustangs that ranged in this territory, hoping to break a few for a rancher in Tucson who paid top dollar for quality horseflesh. Hayes pulled his mount to a stop, removing his worn leather hat to wipe the sweat from his brow. Something had spooked the birds down in the canyon. He'd noticed their sudden flight pattern a moment ago. Years of survival in harsh country had taught him to read such signs. "What do you think, Dodge?" he asked his chestnut gelding, who snorted in response and pawed at the ground. "Yeah, I'm curious too." Hayes dismounted and led Dodge along the rim, searching for a path down. He found a narrow trail that zigzagged to the canyon floor and carefully made his descent. The mustangs could wait. His instincts told him something wasn't right, and he'd learned the hard way never to ignore them. As the sun dipped lower in the western sky, Ruby's initial panic had given way to systematic attempts to free herself. She had managed to move some smaller rocks, but the larger boulders remained immovable. Her hands were raw and bleeding from her efforts, and thirst was becoming a serious concern. "Miss, is someone down there?" A man's voice called from the other side of the rock fall, startling Ruby so badly she nearly fell over.
"Yes, I'm trapped,"
she shouted back, her voice cracking with emotion. "The wall collapsed. I can't get out." "Stay calm," the voice replied, steady and reassuring. "My name is Hayes Porter. I'm going to get you out of there." Ruby pressed herself against the rock pile. "Ruby Blackstone. Please hurry. I don't know how stable these rocks are." Hayes assessed the barrier. It was substantial. A collapse of the canyon wall had created a pile of debris nearly 7 feet high, blocking the narrow passage completely. Moving it all would be impossible, but he might be able to clear enough to create an opening. Miss Blackstone, I need to test the stability. Stand back as far as you can, he called. Ruby retreated until her back pressed against the opposite wall. I'm clear. Hayes began carefully removing smaller rocks, creating a pile beside him. The larger boulders were precariously balanced against each other. One wrong move could send more of the wall crashing down. Sweat soaked through his shirt as he worked methodically, listening for any warning signs of shifting. How long have you been trapped? He asked, partly to keep her calm and partly to gauge her condition. Since mid-morning, Ruby replied. I was collecting plant specimens when I heard a terrible cracking sound. I barely had time to run before everything came down. Hayes nodded to himself. You're lucky. These canyon walls can be treacherous, especially after the spring rains loosen the soil. I'm a botanist, Ruby explained, her voice growing stronger as she spoke about her work. I've been documenting the unique flora that grows in these sheltered environments. Plants that haven't been properly classified before. A lady scientist? Hayes couldn't help the surprise in his voice. Ruby's response came with a hint of defiance. Yes, Mr. Porter. Women are quite capable of scientific thought, despite popular opinion. Hayes chuckled as he heaved another rock aside. I meant no offense, Miss Blackstone. I'm just not accustomed to finding scholars of any gender trapped in canyons. As Hayes worked, Ruby could see small beams of light beginning to break through. Hope surged within her. She had expected to spend the night in the increasingly cold canyon, possibly longer. The thought of freedom made her dizzy with relief. I think I'm making progress, Hayes called. There's a large boulder that's key to this whole pile. If I can shift it without bringing down more of the wall, we should have an opening big enough for you to climb through. And if you can't? Ruby asked, unable to keep the worry from her voice. Hayes paused. Then we try something else. I didn't ride all this way to give up at the first obstacle. Ruby smiled despite herself. There was something reassuring about his confidence, about the steady way he worked while maintaining conversation. She found herself curious about the man on the other side of the rocks. What brings you to Devil's Canyon, Mr. Porter? It's not exactly on the main trail. Hayes leveraged his weight against a large rock, grunting with effort before answering. I'm tracking a herd of mustangs. Spotted their trail heading this direction yesterday. You're a horse trader? Among other things, Hayes replied. I do whatever work needs doing. Scouting, ranching, breaking horses. The frontier doesn't allow for much specialization. Unlike her own narrow focus on botany, Ruby thought. She had the luxury of pursuing a single passion because of her family's means and her academic connections. It was a stark reminder of the different worlds they inhabited. Hayes finally managed to shift the key boulder, creating a small opening near the top of the pile. Sunlight streamed through, illuminating Ruby's face for the first time. Hayes found himself momentarily stunned by the sight of her dirt-smudged cheeks, auburn hair escaping from what had once been a neat bun, and the most determined green eyes he'd ever seen. I can see you, he said, his voice softer than before. Are you injured? Ruby shook her head, squinting against the light. Just some scrapes and bruises. Nothing serious.
Good.
I'm going to clear this opening a bit more, and then you'll need to climb up and through. I'll help you from this side. For the next half hour, Hayes carefully removed more rocks, widening the gap. The sun was now touching the western horizon, casting long shadows across the canyon floor. We need to hurry, Hayes said, reaching his hand through the opening. I don't want us trying to climb out of this canyon in the dark. Ruby gathered her satchel and approached the opening. It was still narrow, but she could see it was passable. She reached up and grasped Hayes's outstretched hand, surprised by its warmth and strength. I'll pull you through, he instructed. Try to keep your body as flat as possible. Ruby nodded and began to climb the rock pile from her side. As she reached the opening, Hayes gripped her arms firmly and pulled. For a moment, she was suspended between the two spaces, rocks pressing against her ribs. Then, with a final tug, Hayes pulled her through, and she tumbled forward into his arms. The momentum sent them both stumbling back, Hayes regaining his balance while keeping Ruby upright. For a moment, they stood there, his arms around her waist, her hands on his chest, both breathing heavily from the exertion. Ruby looked up into Hayes's face tanned by the sun, with lines at the corners of his eyes that spoke of years squinting into the distance. His eyes were a deep blue that reminded her of the bachelor buttons that grew in her mother's garden back east. "Thank you," she said softly, suddenly aware of their proximity. Hayes cleared his throat and stepped back, releasing her. "We're not safe yet. We need to get out of this canyon before dark." Ruby nodded, brushing dust from her skirt. Her practical riding outfit divided skirts that allowed her to sit astride a horse was torn and dirty, but it had protected her from worse injuries during the rock fall. Hayes led her to where Dodge waited patiently, tied to a scrub juniper. The horse nickered softly as they approached. "This is Dodge," Hayes said, patting the gelding's neck. "He's going to help us get out of here." Ruby approached the horse cautiously. "Hello, Dodge." The animal sniffed her outstretched hand, then nudged it gently. "He approves of you," Hayes said with a smile. "That's a good sign. Dodge is an excellent judge of character." Hayes helped Ruby mount, then swung up behind her. The saddle wasn't designed for two, placing them in close proximity. Ruby tried to maintain a proper distance, but as Dodge began picking his way along the canyon floor toward the trail up, the motion of the horse pressed her back against Hayes's chest. "Sorry for the tight quarters," Hayes said near her ear, his breath warm against her neck. "It's not far to the rim." Ruby nodded, not trusting her voice. She had never been this close to a man who wasn't family, and she found the experience disconcertingly pleasant. Hayes smelled of leather, horse, and the sage that grew abundantly throughout the territory since she had come to associate with the West itself. As they ascended the narrow trail, Hayes kept one arm loosely around Ruby's waist for balance. The path was treacherous in places, forcing Dodge to navigate carefully. With each step, Ruby became more aware of the man behind her, the steady rhythm of his breathing, the strength in the arm that held her secure, the occasional murmured encouragement he offered the horse. The sun was setting as they reached the canyon rim, painting the landscape in fiery oranges and deep purples. Hayes guided Dodge to a flat area and dismounted, then reached up to help Ruby down. His hands spanned her waist as he lifted her effortlessly to the ground, and once again they found themselves standing close, his hands lingering perhaps a moment longer than necessary. "We won't make it back to town before dark," Hayes said, stepping back and surveying the horizon. "I have a camp set up about a mile from here. If you're amenable, we can spend the night there and head to Silverton in the morning." Ruby hesitated. Spending the night unchaperoned with a stranger went against every social convention she had been raised with. Yet the alternative was attempting to navigate unfamiliar territory in the dark, which seemed equally unwise. As if sensing her dilemma, Hayes added, "I give you my word as a gentleman that you'll be safe, Miss Blackstone." "I wouldn't suggest it if I saw any better option." There was something in his direct gaze that inspired trust. Ruby nodded. "I accept your offer, Mr. Porter. And please call me Ruby." "Hayes," he offered in return, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. He mounted Dodge again and extended his hand to help Ruby up behind him. Hayes's camp was simple but well organized, situated in a small clearing surrounded by juniper trees. A lean-to shelter had been constructed against a large boulder, with a small fire pit in front. Hayes quickly got a fire going while Ruby sat on a fallen log, suddenly aware of how exhausted she was. "Are you hungry?" Hayes asked, rummaging in his saddlebags. Ruby nodded. "Famished, actually. I haven't eaten since breakfast." Hayes produced jerky, dried apples, and a small loaf of bread that had seen better days. "Not exactly a feast fit for a lady scientist, but it'll keep your strength up." Ruby accepted the food gratefully. "It looks wonderful. I've learned not to be particular about meals in the field." They ate in companionable silence as darkness fell completely. The fire crackled between them, casting flickering shadows on their faces. Above them, stars appeared in increasing numbers until the sky was awash with light. "It's beautiful," Ruby murmured, gazing upward. "I never saw stars like this in Boston." Hayes followed her gaze. "That's one thing I love about this country. No matter how harsh it gets, it offers moments of pure beauty that make it all worthwhile." "How long have you been in the West?" Ruby asked, curious about this man who had saved her. Hayes tossed another small branch on the fire. "Came out after the war. Couldn't settle back into normal life in Pennsylvania. Needed space, I guess. Been moving around ever since." "The Civil War?" Ruby asked softly. Hayes nodded, his expression momentarily distant. "Fought with the Union. 7th Pennsylvania Cavalry. I was just a boy when I enlisted, 17, and full of ideals." He gave a short laugh. "Grew up fast." Ruby studied him across the fire. In its light, she could see the faint scar that ran along his jawline, the weathered quality of his skin that spoke of years outdoors. He couldn't be much past 30, yet he carried himself with the quiet confidence of a man who had seen much of life. "And you?" Hayes asked, breaking the silence. "What brings a Boston botanist to the Arizona territory? Besides getting trapped in canyons, that is." Ruby smiled. "The plants, of course. There are species here that haven't been properly documented. I'm contributing to a comprehensive botanical survey of the Western Territories." "All on your own? That seems like work for a university expedition, not a solitary scientist." "I'm affiliated with Harvard's Botanical Gardens," Ruby explained. "But yes, I work alone."
It's
"Simpler that way." Hayes raised an eyebrow. "Simpler? Or just harder to tell a woman no when she's already out here doing the work?" Ruby laughed, surprised by his perception. "Perhaps a bit of both. My father is a professor of natural history. He taught me everything he would have taught a son, including how to navigate academic politics."
smart man. He is commented.
Teaching his daughter to think for herself. "He is," Ruby agreed, feeling a pang of homesickness. "Though I think he regrets it now that I've moved so far away." Hayes prepared the lean-to for Ruby, laying out his bedroll and adding his saddle blanket for extra warmth. "You take the shelter," he said. "I'll sleep by the fire." "Are you sure? I don't want to displace you from your own camp." Hayes waved away her concern. "I've slept under the stars more nights than I can count. One more won't hurt me." As Ruby settled into the bedroll, exhaustion overtook her. The last thing she remembered was the sight of Hayes sitting by the fire, his profile outlined against the night sky, keeping watch. She woke to the smell of coffee brewing. The sky was just beginning to lighten with pre-dawn glow. Hayes was already up, tending a small fire with a battered coffee pot nestled in the coals. "Morning," he said, noticing her stir. "Hope you like your coffee strong." "It's the only way I know how to make it." Ruby sat up, running a hand through her tangled hair. "Strong is perfect, thank you." Hayes poured the dark liquid into a tin cup and handed it to her. Their fingers brushed in exchange, sending an unexpected warmth through Ruby's hand. "How are you feeling?" Hayes asked, studying her face. "Any delayed effects from yesterday's ordeal?" Ruby took inventory of her body. "Some bruises making themselves known, but otherwise I'm fine." She sipped the coffee, finding it indeed very strong but welcome. "Better than fine, actually. I'm alive, thanks to you." Hayes shrugged off her gratitude. "Right place, right time. Anyone would have done the same." "But it wasn't anyone. It was you," Ruby insisted. "And I'm grateful." Hayes met her eyes for a long moment before nodding. "You're welcome, Ruby." They broke camp efficiently, Ruby helping to pack Hayes's gear. As they worked side by side, Ruby found herself stealing glances at him. In the clear morning light, she could better appreciate his features, the strong line of his jaw, The way his dark hair curled slightly at the nape of his neck, the capable hands that moved with such assurance. Hayes caught her looking once and held her gaze, a question in his eyes that made Ruby's cheeks warm. She turned away, busying herself with tightening the straps on her satchel. The ride to Silverton took most of the morning. They traveled at a leisurely pace, Hayes pointing out landmarks and sharing stories of his experiences in the territory. Ruby found herself laughing at his dry humor and impressed by his knowledge of the land. "That bush there," Hayes said, pointing to a scrubby plant with tiny yellow flowers. "Old Hank Williams claims it cures rheumatism if you boil the roots and drink the tea. Nearly killed himself testing the theory." Laria tridentata, Ruby identified automatically. Creosote bush. And while it does have medicinal properties, it can be toxic in large doses. She glanced at Hayes. "Your friend is lucky. Hank's too ornery to be killed by a bush," Hayes replied with a grin. "He swears by it now, rheumatism and all." As they approached Silverton, Ruby became increasingly aware that their time together was coming to an end. She would return to her room at Mrs. Holloway's boarding house, and Hayes would continue his pursuit of the wild mustangs. The thought left her with an unexpected sense of loss. "Where will you go after you find your horses?" she asked as the first buildings of the small settlement came into view. Hayes adjusted his hat against the midday sun. "Depends on how many I catch and what condition they're in. Might head to Tucson, might try my luck in Prescott. Haven't decided yet." Ruby nodded, trying to keep her voice casual. "I'll be in Silverton for another month at least. There's still much to document in the surrounding area." Hayes was quiet for a moment. Devil's Canyon included? "Perhaps not that particular location," Ruby conceded with a small smile. "Though there were some fascinating specimens I didn't get to collect. If you're planning more expeditions, you might consider taking a guide," Hayes suggested, his tone carefully neutral. "These canyons can be dangerous, as you've discovered." Ruby turned slightly to look at him. "Are you offering your services, Mr. Porter?" "I might be," Hayes replied, meeting her eyes. "For the right client." The streets of Silverton were busy with the usual activity of a frontier town wagons delivering goods, cowboys fresh off the trail looking for entertainment, shopkeepers sweeping their boardwalks. Hayes guided Dodge toward the modest two-story building that served as Mrs. Holloway's boarding house. As they dismounted in front, Ruby became acutely aware of her disheveled appearance. Her clothing was torn and dirty, her hair a tangled mess escaping its pins. What would Mrs. Holloway think? What would anyone think seeing her arrive in such a state with a strange man? Hayes seemed to read her thoughts. "Would you prefer I leave you here?" To avoid any talk. Ruby straightened her shoulders.
No.
"You saved my life. I won't pretend otherwise to protect my reputation." She smiled wryly. "Besides, being a woman in science has already made me something of a curiosity. This will just give them something new to whisper about." Mrs. Holloway opened the door before they reached it, her expression shifting from concern to relief at the sight of Ruby. "Miss Blackstone. Thank heavens. When you didn't return last night, I was beside myself with worry. I was about to send for the sheriff to organize a search party." "I apologize for causing you concern, Mrs. Holloway," Ruby said. "I had a bit of trouble in Devil's Canyon. Mr. Porter here came to my rescue." Mrs. Holloway turned her attention to Hayes, assessing him with the practiced eye of someone who had seen all types come through her establishment. "Then we are in your debt, Mr. Porter," she said, her tone warming slightly. "Would you care to come in for a proper meal? It's the least I can offer." Hayes removed his hat. "That's kind of you, madam, but I should see to my horse and my business in town." Ruby felt a stab of disappointment. "At least let me pay you for your trouble, Mr. Porter." Hayes shook his head firmly. "No payment necessary, Miss Blackstone." "As I said, anyone would have done the same." An awkward silence fell between them, with Mrs. Holloway looking from one to the other with increasing interest. "Well," Ruby finally said, "thank you again for everything." Hayes nodded, replacing his hat. My pleasure, Miss Blackstone. He hesitated, then added, if you're serious about continuing your research in the area, my offer stands. I know these canyons better than most. I'll consider it, Ruby replied, trying to sound noncommittal despite the leap of her heart. Hayes mounted Dodge and tipped his hat to both women. Ladies. With that, he turned his horse and rode toward the livery stable at the end of the street. Mrs. Holloway watched him go with an appraising eye. Handsome man, she commented. And a gentleman, it seems. Ruby couldn't disagree with either assessment. Yes, he is. Well, come inside, dear. You look like you could use a bath and a hot meal, not necessarily in that order. 3 days passed with no sign of Hayes Porter. Ruby tried to focus on organizing her specimens and notes, but found her thoughts constantly drifting to the man who had pulled her from the darkness of the canyon into the light. She told herself it was natural to think of someone who had saved her life, nothing more. On the 4th day, Ruby was sitting on the boarding house porch, sketching a plant specimen, when a familiar chestnut gelding appeared at the hitching post. Hayes dismounted, looking somewhat more polished than when she had last seen him. His clothes were clean, his face freshly shaved, though he still carried the unmistakable air of a man more at home on the range than in town. Ruby set aside her sketchbook, her heart beating faster. Mr. Porter, this is a surprise. Hayes approached the porch steps, hat in hand. Miss Blackstone, I hope I'm not interrupting your work. Not at all, Ruby assured him. Please join me. Hayes sat in the chair beside her, setting his hat on his knee. For a moment, he seemed uncharacteristically unsure of himself. I've been thinking, he finally said, about your botanical survey. Have you? Ruby asked, trying to keep her voice steady. Hayes nodded. It's important work. Documenting what grows here, understanding the land. Too many people come west seeing only what they can take, not what they can learn. Ruby was surprised by his insight. That's exactly what drives my research. Every plant has a purpose in nature, a story to tell about the environment it grows in. I'd like to help, Hayes said directly. I know these territories where to find the most diverse plant life, which canyons are stable, which water sources are reliable. He paused. And I can ensure you don't get trapped by any more falling rocks. Ruby studied him, trying to discern his motivation. Why would you want to do this? Surely guiding a botanist around canyons isn't as profitable as catching wild mustangs. Hayes held her gaze steadily. Maybe I've developed an interest in botany. Ruby raised an eyebrow skeptically. Hayes's mouth quirked into a small smile. Or maybe I've developed an interest in a particular botanist. The directness of his statement took Ruby's breath away. In Boston, courtship was a careful dance of social calls and chaperoned outings. Here was Hayes Porter, a man she barely knew, openly expressing interest after knowing her less than a week. And yet, hadn't she felt the same inexplicable connection? The same pull toward someone who, by all reasonable standards, should be nothing more than a brief encounter in her life? That's very forward of you, Mr. Porter, she managed to say. Hayes, he corrected gently. And yes, it is. But I've found life out here is too unpredictable to waste time with indirection. If you're not interested, just say so, and I'll wish you well with your research and be on my way. Ruby considered his words. She had come west partly to escape the constraints of Eastern society, to find freedom not just for her scientific work, but for herself as a woman. Wasn't this part of that freedom the ability to follow her heart without the suffocating rules of Boston drawing rooms? I might be interested in such an arrangement, Ruby said carefully. For scientific purposes, of course. Hayes's smile broadened. Of course. Purely scientific. Their eyes met, and Ruby couldn't help but return a smile. When would this expedition begin? I have business to conclude in town today, Hayes replied. But I could be ready tomorrow, if that suits you. Tomorrow would be perfect, Ruby said. I'll need to prepare supplies and equipment. Hayes stood, picking up his hat. Until tomorrow, then, Miss Blackstone. Ruby, she corrected, echoing his earlier words. If we're to be working together, you should use my given name. Ruby, Hayes repeated, as if testing the sound of it. It suits you. As he walked back to his horse, Ruby realized she was smiling broadly. Mrs. Holloway appeared in the doorway, having undoubtedly overheard their conversation. Scientific purposes, indeed, the older woman said with knowing amusement. That young man didn't ride into town and clean himself up for botany, my dear. Ruby blushed but couldn't deny it. Is it that obvious? Only to anyone with eyes, Mrs. Holloway replied kindly. He seems a good sort, though. Not like some of the drifters that pass through. He is a good man, Ruby said with certainty. He saved my life without hesitation or expectation of reward. Mrs. Holloway nodded approvingly. That tells you more about a man's character than any fine words or promises. She patted Ruby's shoulder. Just be careful with your heart, dear. The West changes people sometimes for better, sometimes not. The next morning dawned clear and cool, perfect for traveling. Hayes arrived promptly as promised, leading a second horse, a gentle mare equipped with a side saddle. I thought you might prefer your own mount for a longer journey, he explained as Ruby descended the porch steps with her equipment. This is Daisy. She's steady and sure-footed, good for canyon country. Ruby approached the mare, stroking her soft nose. She's lovely. Thank you for thinking of it. Hayes helped load Ruby's scientific equipment onto the pack horse he had brought, handling her delicate instruments with surprising care. As they worked together, Ruby noticed how easily they fell into a rhythm, anticipating each other's movements, without need for instruction. Mrs. Holloway provided them with a parcel of food for their journey, and a knowing smile that made Ruby blush again. Be back in a week, she instructed, or I really will send the sheriff after you this time. They set out as the town was coming to life, heading west toward a region Hayes promised contained botanical wonders that would fill a dozen scientific journals. Ruby found herself stealing glances at her companion as they rode, admiring the easy way he sat his horse, the alertness with which he surveyed their surroundings. Where exactly are we going? She asked as they left the last outlying farms behind. There's a series of hidden canyons about a day's ride from here, Hayes explained. The Apache call it the place of flowering stones. It has its own microclimate plants grow there that you won't find anywhere else in the territory. Ruby's scientific curiosity was immediately piqued. How do you know about it if it's hidden? Hayes gave her a sidelong glance. I told you I was a scout, among other things. During the Apache campaigns, I was hired to track for the army. He frowned slightly. Not my proudest work, but it taught me a lot about this land. An old medicine man showed me the canyons after I helped his grandson escape from Fort Grant. The revelation added another layer to Hayes's character. He was a man who made his own moral judgments, regardless of who was paying him. You helped an Apache prisoner escape? Ruby asked, both impressed and concerned. Hayes shrugged. The boy was 16, accused of horse theft without evidence. Wouldn't have lasted a month in that place. He looked at Ruby directly. Does that change your opinion of me? Breaking the law? Going against the army? Ruby considered the question seriously. No, she finally said. It suggests you value justice above blind obedience. I find that admirable. Something in Hayes's expression softened. Most women would be scandalized. I'm not most women, Ruby replied simply. Hayes's smile returned. No, you certainly are not, Ruby Blackstone. They made camp that evening beside a small stream, working together to establish their site with the efficiency of longtime partners rather than new acquaintances. Hayes built a fire while Ruby prepared a simple meal from Mrs. Holloway's provisions. They ate as the stars appeared overhead, sharing stories of their lives. Ruby told Hayes about growing up in her father's shadow, spending hours in Harvard's herbarium, dreaming of discovering new species. Hayes spoke of his childhood in Pennsylvania, his difficult years after the war, and his gradual healing in the open spaces of the West. "The first time I saw the desert bloom after spring rains," he said, gazing into the fire, "I felt something inside me shift back into place. Like if these flowers could push through stone to reach the sun, maybe I could find my way forward too." Ruby was touched by the poetry in his words, so at odds with his rugged exterior. "That's beautiful, Hayes." He looked almost embarrassed. "Don't tell anyone. I've got a reputation to maintain." Ruby laughed. "Your secret is safe with me." As the fire burned down to embers, Hayes prepared Ruby's tent while making his own bed near the fire. The pattern of their first night together repeated, but this time with an unspoken awareness between them, a current of possibility that hadn't existed before. "Good night, Ruby," Hayes said as she retired to her tent. "Good night, Hayes," she replied, holding his gaze perhaps a moment longer than necessary. In the morning, they continued their journey, the terrain growing more dramatic as they approached the hidden canyons. By mid-afternoon, they were riding through a narrow passage between towering red rock walls. Almost there, Hayes assured her as the passage twisted and turned. "It opens up ahead." When they emerged, Ruby gasped in amazement. Before them lay a hidden valley, sheltered by cliff walls on all sides. A small spring created a verdant oasis at its center, surrounded by plants Ruby had never seen before: unique varieties of cactus with vibrant blooms, unfamiliar shrubs covered in delicate flowers, and what appeared to be entirely new species thriving in this protected environment. "Hayes, this is extraordinary," she exclaimed, dismounting quickly. "Some of these plants, they're completely undocumented." She was already reaching for her specimen case, her scientific mind racing with possibilities. Hayes watched her with undisguised pleasure at her reaction. "I thought you'd appreciate it. Take your time, we can camp here for a few days if you like." They established a comfortable camp near the spring. For the next 3 days, Ruby worked from dawn until dusk, collecting, sketching, and documenting dozens of plant species. Hayes divided his time between hunting small game for their meals, exploring the surrounding areas, and assisting Ruby with her work. He proved to be an attentive and intelligent helper, quickly learning to identify the characteristics Ruby looked for in her specimens and often spotting unusual plants before she did. His knowledge of the land complemented her scientific expertise in ways that made their work together seamlessly productive. On the evening of the 3rd day, as they sat beside their fire sharing the rabbit stew Hayes had prepared, Ruby realized something had changed between them. The initial attraction had deepened into genuine admiration and affection. She enjoyed his company not just because he was handsome and had saved her life, but because his mind challenged hers, because his quiet strength made her feel both protected and empowered, because his respect for her work was absolutely genuine. "A penny for your thoughts," Hayes said, breaking into her reverie. Ruby smiled. "I was just thinking how fortunate I am that you happened to be tracking mustangs near Devil's Canyon that day." "I'm beginning to think it wasn't just fortune," Hayes replied, his voice low. "I've never been one for fate or destiny, but meeting you." He paused, searching for words. "It feels significant, like something important has shifted." Ruby's heart quickened. "I feel it too," she admitted softly. Hayes set aside his plate and moved to sit beside her on the fallen log she had claimed as a seat. The firelight illuminated their faces, casting everything else into shadow. "Ruby," he said, her name like a caress on his lips. "I know we've known each other less than 2 weeks. I know you have your research, and I have my wandering ways. But I can't ignore what's happening between us." Ruby turned toward him, suddenly breathless. "Neither can I." Hayes reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wished, and brushed a strand of hair from her cheek. His fingers lingered, tracing the line of her jaw with gentle reverence. "May I kiss you?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. In answer, Ruby leaned forward, closing the distance between them. Their lips met softly at first, a tentative exploration that quickly deepened as Hayes's arm encircled her waist, drawing her closer. Ruby's hands found their way to his shoulders, feeling the solid strength beneath his shirt. When they finally parted, both were breathing faster. Hayes rested his forehead against hers, his eyes closed as if memorizing the moment. "I never expected this," Ruby confessed. "When I came west, I was looking for plants, not—" She hesitated. "Not love." Hayes finished for her, opening his eyes to meet hers. The word hung between them, both thrilling and terrifying in its implications. Ruby had never allowed herself to consider love as part of her life's plan. Her focus had always been her scientific career, her independence. "Is that what this is?" she asked, not pulling away, but needing to understand. Hayes took her hand, his thumb tracing circles on her palm. "I think it could be, given time. I know I've never felt this way about anyone before." Ruby nodded slowly. "Nor have I." She squeezed his hand. "But Hayes, my work is important," he finished. "I would never ask you to give it up." "And you're wandering?" she countered. "The open trails, the freedom you cherish?" Hayes considered this. "Maybe I've been wandering because I hadn't found a reason to stay in one place." His eyes held hers steadily. "Maybe you're that reason." The remainder of their expedition took on a new dimension. Days were still devoted to Ruby's research, but evenings belonged to them, to conversations that stretched into the night, to kisses that grew increasingly passionate, to the gradual revealing of hearts long kept guarded. By the time they returned to Silverton, something profound had changed for both of them. As they approached the town, Ruby felt a mixture of emotions: happiness in what she had found with Hayes, anxiety about what would happen next. Hayes seemed to sense her uncertainty. "What are you thinking?" he asked as they rode side by side. Ruby took a deep breath. "I'm thinking about tomorrow, and the day after, and all the days to come. I'm wondering if what we've found can survive outside that hidden canyon." Hayes guided Dodge closer to Ruby's mare so he could reach for her hand. "I believe it can, if we want it to." "And do you want it to?" Ruby asked, vulnerability clear in her voice. Hayes's answer came without hesitation.
"Yes."
"More than anything." Mrs. Holloway was waiting on the porch when they arrived, her expression shifting from relief to knowing satisfaction as she observed the changed dynamic between them. Ruby's cheeks flushed under her scrutiny. "Welcome back, you two," the older woman called. "Successful expedition, I take it?" "Very," Ruby replied, accepting Hayes's help to dismount. Their hands lingered together, perhaps a moment longer than necessary. "I've discovered several previously undocumented species. And made other discoveries as well, I'd wager," Mrs. Holloway commented with a sly smile. Hayes cleared his throat. "Mrs. Holloway, I wonder if I might speak with you about taking a room here for an extended stay. I find I have business in Silverton that may keep me here a while." Mrs. Holloway's eyes twinkled. "Do you now?" "Well, as it happens, I do have a room available. Second floor, west side. Has a nice view of the sunset." "That sounds perfect," Hayes replied, his eyes on Ruby rather than the landlady. In the weeks that followed, Hayes and Ruby fell into a new routine. She continued her botanical work, preparing specimens to be sent east and writing detailed reports of her findings. Hayes found employment with a local rancher who valued his expertise with horses, while still making time to accompany Ruby on shorter expeditions into the surrounding countryside. Their courtship progressed with the same directness that characterized their initial connection. Hayes was a frequent guest for dinner at the boarding house, and they often spent evenings on the porch, talking as the sun set over the mountains. Mrs. Holloway maintained a discreet presence as chaperone, though her knowing smiles suggested she saw their relationship as a foregone conclusion. 1 month after their return from the place of flowering stones, Hayes took Ruby back to the canyon where they had first met. The approach was different this time. No rockfall barred their path, and Ruby entered the narrow passage without fear, secure in Hayes's presence beside her. They dismounted at the spot where Hayes had cleared the rocks to free her. Ruby looked around, remembering the panic she had felt, the desperation, and then the overwhelming relief at Hayes's voice coming from the other side. "It seems smaller now," she commented, running her hand along the canyon wall. "Does it?" Hayes asked, standing close behind her. Ruby turned to face him. "Everything seems different now. My whole world has expanded." She smiled up at him. "Because of you." Hayes took her hands in his. "Ruby Blackstone, when I found you trapped in this canyon, I thought I was just helping a stranger in trouble. I had no idea I was actually finding my future." He dropped to one knee, still holding her hands. "I love you. Your brilliance, your courage, your determination. I want to build a life with you, one that honors your work and your independence, but joins our paths together." He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small ring with a single emerald. "Will you marry me?" Ruby's eyes filled with tears as she looked down at the man who had carried her from darkness into light in more ways than one. The answer came without hesitation or doubt. "Yes, Hayes Porter. Yes, I will." When they returned to Silverton, they brought news not only of their engagement, but also of their plans. Hayes had purchased land near the place of Flowering Stones, a small ranch with access to the hidden canyons. There they would establish both a home and a research station where Ruby could continue her botanical work while Hayes raised horses. Mrs. Holloway was the first to congratulate them, embracing Ruby with genuine affection. "I knew it from the moment he brought you back that first day," she declared. "Some things are just meant to be." They were married in Silverton that autumn, with Ruby's father making the long journey from Boston to give his daughter away. Though initially skeptical of her frontier romance, Professor Blackstone found himself approving of the steady-eyed cowboy who so clearly adored his daughter and respected her scientific pursuits. Their wedding night was spent in the hidden canyon, in a small cabin Hayes had built during the weeks leading up to their marriage. As they lay together beneath the star-filled sky, visible through the skylight Hayes had crafted specifically for stargazing, Ruby marveled at the journey that had brought them to this moment. "If those rocks hadn't fallen," she whispered against Hayes's chest, "if you hadn't heard my calls for help." Hayes pulled her closer. "I would have found you somehow. If not then, somewhere else. Some other canyon, some other time." He kissed her forehead. "Some things are just meant to be, remember?" Ruby smiled in the darkness. The botanist in her wanted to argue that life was ruled by science, not fate. But the woman in her, the one who had found love in the most unexpected place, was increasingly convinced that perhaps Mrs. Holloway was right after all. "Some things are just meant to be," she agreed, reaching up to find his lips with hers. And as Hayes gathered her in his arms, the stars wheeled overhead, witness to a love born in darkness, but destined to thrive in light.